This is certainly not the kind of first time in recent memory that the BBC has been accused of mishandling issues of impartiality and the way that they treat staff in relation to those policies associated with impartiality. But I would say, really during the time that I've been following, BBC affairs, which has really been the last sort of 10, 15 years, this has been really the example that has shown really a kind of brazen willingness by the BBC to actually sort of bow to influence and pressure from certain people within the government to try to remove certain elements from the BBC that are critical to the government. It's certainly not unusual in the slightest that BBC employees or journalists would actually be critical in their own private social media accounts in relation to a whole host of different government and political affairs. I think it actually took a lot of people by a huge amount of surprise, including Gary Lineker, the fact that he was attempting to be silenced in this way around 4 days ago. And I think the fact that actually the BBC took such a drastic action to do this and actually was willing to risk this huge response that actually we did see afterwards that resulted in a huge amount of its sports coverage not being able to be aired really shows the kind of pressure that it was under from the government, the fact that it was willing to do something that was very, very risky in terms of what it was able to do. And I think it's ultimately a positive thing, to be honest, because I think it has really sort of shone a light on so many of the issues that have been building in the BBC, particularly under the recent government, which has tried to, I would say, influence the BBC in a way in which other previous governments haven't. And so I think ultimately it will result in a greater push for transparency and greater sort of understanding of objective standards that we require for any service to be considered truly kind of objective and impartial.
Yes, in that sense, would you say that this was perhaps an eye-opener for a large section of the British public, for those of us who are outside of Britain as well, that, here is a media organization that perhaps is not as impartial or as neutral as we thought it is. With this example, questions will be raised. Do you think that the credibility has taken a hit as well with it?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, naturally in any country, not everyone be following politics very closely. But I think the fact that this involved such a well-known, such a popular sports figure meant that this issue sort of reached beyond so many of the kind of usual people who would typically follow politics in this way, and really highlighted the BBC and its behavior to be acting in a way to say to a whole sort of new group of people who might traditionally not be looking at this in this way. In terms of your question about credibility, I certainly think it actually massively has impacted the BBC's credibility. Firstly, just for the way in which this has actually unfolded. We saw, initially the BBC say it was going to talk to Gary Lineker, try to resolve it. And then we saw the BBC, pulling Gary Lineker basically out of programmes. And then just this morning, we've seen the BBC essentially having to row back on that and undertake a huge U-turn, which has meant essentially that, Gary Lineker, in the minds of a lot of people, has sort of come up on top of this issue. So I think certainly the BBC, the way that it has behaved, has certainly not been viewed as particularly professional sort of way of doing things. But I think it certainly does impact other individuals as well. I think Tim Davie, who is the BBC's Director General, who's really been the major face of what's been happening at the BBC at the moment, has taken a huge hit to his credibility simply because of what he's been doing. And I also think the other person who is in the firing line is Richard Sharp, who is the Conservative government's appointed chairman of the BBC, who has been completely absent from comment or from TV over the last 5 days, mainly because of the fact that he himself is under investigation for his own links to the Conservative Party and to Boris Johnson, and over questions whether he really is an appropriate candidate to be or appropriate person to be leading the BBC. So I think certainly it's massively impacted the credibility of the BBC.
I want to know whether public sentiment is turning against BBC on this, because, I was reading reports, of course, viewers, it said that certain viewers, it could turn viewers away from BBC, which is funded by a £159 annual license fee on all television watching households, and the broadcaster remains a central presence in the British cultural life. It is battling to stay relevant as well among the younger audiences. And at a time like this, certain conservative lawmakers, as we understand, want to scrap the license fee. So it's in a very precarious position in that sense. And with this episode, it has become amply clear that the employees tend to be more on the side of any single anchor who is targeted in this manner. The solidarity display was also something that the world has taken note of.
I think that's quite right. I mean, it really does cut to the heart of what the whole purpose of the BBC is. And I think ultimately, the BBC can withstand sort of short-term issues, but I think really if this becomes a much larger issue to do with the way that the British public perceive the BBC, and it can't be perceived or it can't be trusted to kind of provide an impartial service, then ultimately I think there will be, large questions raised over the extent to which the BBC should continue in its current role. But I do think it's important just to note the fact that, there is likely to be a sort of change in government in the UK over the next 2 years, with the current incumbent Conservative Party likely replaced by the Labour Party. And I think that will really provide a sort of opportunity for renewal of the BBC, in which perhaps it's not quite possible to take place at the moment.
Right.
But I think, certainly the BBC is going to have to respond to this in quite a strong way to ensure that it maintains relevance, and also it doesn't remain sort of tainted by the scandal. And I think one of the problems, as I mentioned, is that the current leadership of the BBC, I think, will continue to be tainted by the scandal for such a long time, which will mean that really their positions are really going to become increasingly untenable.